Let's talk more about the races ahead. We have, obviously, on Saturday, the South Carolina primary. Coming up on Tuesday, Super Tuesday. It is super, by the way. There are primaries in Alabama, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. A lot of delegates up for grab, about 1,300. You need 1,991 in order to be the nominee. So this could put us a little bit closer to, if not the conclusion, at least a better understanding of how this race is going to move forward. Joining us now is Kendall Scudder, who's a Democratic strategist, co-host of P.O.T.U.S Texas, a co-founder of Armadillo Strategies, tweeting at Kendall Scudder, and is with us now. Kendall Scudder, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
Talk about Texas. I know Texas changed, right? In other words, 2008, we had this weird thing happen where Hillary Clinton, I think, won the primary, but Barack Obama came away with more delegates. But they've changed the way they do things in Texas now, right?
Yeah, we used to have a Texas two-step where about 60% of your delegates would come from the primary, about 40% would come from a caucus. But now we've shifted that up. The DNC requested it, and so all of those delegates are now coming from a primary that we have on Tuesday.
I have a question. Is Beto O'Rourke still on the ballot?
I don't believe he is. I don't believe he is. Whenever I went to go and vote in early voting, I didn't see him there.
All right. How much is early voting a factor? Because we know that there was a lot of that in Nevada, and it may be that was one of the reasons why Elizabeth Warren couldn't take what was considered a great debate performance and turn it into votes. Is that a factor in the Texas Super Tuesday primary?
In Texas, about 61% of voters vote early, and we've seen a big surge, actually, this cycle, so it may even be more than that. Or maybe we'll just have historic turnout numbers. We're already exceeding 2016 and 2018. We're not quite over that 2008 threshold yet, but who knows? I think we might get there. Early voting numbers sure seem to be making a huge impact. I think that especially in mail-in ballots, and so I think that particularly benefits folks like Biden, who may have been doing really well back in January. The first ballots were cast in Texas before anybody cast a vote in places like Nevada or South Carolina.
As I mentioned, with Texas, you've got up for grabs 262 delegates, which is way more than we've even had in total so far. Iowa was 49, 33 in New Hampshire, 48 in Nevada. South Carolina this week has 63, but it's all proportional, and it's kind of confusing for people. I know, we see 15% is the threshold, but it's 15% in South Carolina threshold for different districts, and it's broken up into districts, and so it's really tough to tell where the delegates are going to go until it's all said and done. How complicated is it in Texas?
It's pretty complicated. Here in Texas, we are the only state that divides ours up by state Senate district. So folks are going to be looking at particular state Senate districts to figure out where success is going to be had. That's why a lot of people are asking why people aren't having events in certain areas of the state whenever they may be heavily populated. It's all about the way that the delegates are proportioned by Senate district. So what you're going to see is probably about 50% of the delegates that are going to be coming from an at-large pool, and it may be a little less than that, and you're going to be seeing about 55, so probably about 45, 55 that are going to be coming from on a basis of Senate district proportion.
Kendall Scudder, a co-host of P.O.T.U.S Texas, is a Democratic strategist, co-founder of Armadillo Strategies. We're talking Super Tuesday in this case. Is Michael Bloomberg going to be a factor in Texas Tuesday?
He is. A recent poll that came out yesterday, or maybe 2 days ago, actually had him at 17%. So he's clearing that 15% threshold right now. So I think the person that affects the most is probably Joe Biden. So if you end up adding up Joe Biden and Michael Bloomberg, you're actually going to be surpassing that front runner Bernie Sanders. But he's definitely taken a huge chunk out of what kind of that mainstream Democratic point of view would be. Of course, there's a 15% threshold in Texas. So right now, the only three people that we're seeing in polling that are crossing that threshold are Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and Michael Bloomberg.
So give us your expert opinion. What does that mean for the race moving forward, if indeed we were to see that kind of result reflected not just in Texas but in big delegate states like California, which has 495 delegates up for grabs?
Yeah, well, in California right now, Bernie's the only one that's pulling above that threshold. I mean, if that happens, That's huge for Bernie Sanders. I don't know how a lot of people come back from that. A third of the delegates are on the plate on Super Tuesday. I think that what that means is that after Tuesday, you're going to see a whole lot of folks dropping out because they just don't have a path forward. So Amy Klobuchar really needs to have a good night. Pete Buttigieg really needs to have a good night. Elizabeth Warren really needs to have a good night. Tom Steyer needs to have a good night. And if they don't, you're going to start seeing it really consolidate down around Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and Michael Bloomberg, in my opinion.
To that point, we've heard, obviously, if some of these candidates, for example, Senator Klobuchar, she may wind up winning in Minnesota, which is her home state. But on the other hand, if she doesn't see a path forward to her nomination, but if all of them stay in, there's really no path forward for Bernie Sanders to getting to the 1,991 he needs. And one wonders what kind of pressure is going to be brought to bear on these other candidates from mainstream Democrats who are concerned about the possibility of a Bernie Sanders candidacy.
Well, just because you've suspended your campaign doesn't mean you're forfeiting delegates, right? So just because someone suspends their campaign doesn't mean they aren't going to play a factor in a convention that a lot of people are thinking could potentially be one of the first brokered conventions that we've seen in my lifetime. And so they're all going to be a factor if that's the case, whether you have 8 delegates or you have a couple hundred delegates. So Amy Klobuchar being able to win in Minnesota will put her in a good position when she gets to the convention. I think what mainstream Democrats are looking for is a way for kind of the more moderate mainstream wing of the party to total their delegates above what Bernie Sanders is receiving. Elizabeth Warren's a bit of a wild card there because she tends to be more progressive than a lot of the other folks in the race. So we're not sure where that would fall. But I think that's a big thing to watch is what is the total number of delegates that the more moderate or mainstream wing of the party are getting? And does it exceed the number of delegates that Bernie Sanders is receiving? Because if we go into a convention that's brokered, I think that a lot of those folks are going to consolidate to try to make sure that the nominee is someone like Joe Biden.
Kendall Scudder is with us, co-host of P.O.T.U.S, Texas Democratic Strategist. Let's talk about key constituencies. In Florida, for example, a lot of pushback against Senator Sanders because of comments he made about Fidel Castro and the Cuba regime. In addition to that, there's the Latino votes in Texas, which is a different kind of Latino vote. I mean, let's face it, it's not a monolithic group. But I wonder about reaching out to groups that are traditionally supporters of the Democratic Party, African Americans, Latinos in Texas and beyond. What's your sense of who has the advantage there?
Well, in Texas, there's a very high amount of Latinx voters. The problem in Texas that we've had, and why it hasn't ever flipped over for the Democrats, is that they aren't quite moving in the same political demographics as the rest of the state. They tend to err a little bit more conservative. They still are on the side of Democrats, but they're not quite as far as the rest of the state or the rest of the country. So I think that you're seeing a lot of work to do outreach there in the state, particularly in the Valley, because, look, Texas has the lowest voter turnout in the country, and I think that's why Texas is really on the plate these days. It's because folks realize that if there's a large investment in voter turnout in Texas and maybe Spanish language media and a real effort to register those voters, then you're going to see a huge tilt in Texas. So I think Latinx voters are number one there. African American voters, while they aren't as large of a percentage of the population in Texas, they're a very large percentage of the population of Democratic primary voters. That's why you're seeing large ad spends in places like Houston and in Dallas. There's also larger ad spends than I've ever seen in places like Tyler, because East Texas has a really high population there. So it'll be interesting to see what that population number is. And then I think it also really comes down to suburbia these days. Places like Collin County, Williamson County, Tarrant, Denton, Fort Bend County. Those are going to be the places that we've got to make inroads in order to flip the state in November. So there are a lot of early investments that are being done in those places.
Wow, interesting to watch. Great granular detail on this, and it's obviously one state we'll be watching closely on Tuesday and beyond because it's key. Obviously, if President Trump wants to win re-election, he's got to win Texas again. We'll see how that moves forward. I do appreciate you joining us. Kendall Scudder, thanks for being on POTUS today.
Hey, no problem. I appreciate you having me.
Kendall Scudder, co-host of Pod Bless Texas, the co-founder of Armadillo Strategies, Democratic strategist, joining us to handicap Tuesday's Super Tuesday voting in Texas and beyond. He is tweeting at Kendall Scudder, SCUDDERD.